The Treaty of Versailles was one of the peace treaties at the end of World War I. It ended the state of war between Germany and the Allied Powers. It was signed on the 28th of June 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. The other Central Powers on the German side of World War I were dealt with in separate treaties. Although the armistice, signed on the 11th of November 1918, ended the actual fighting, it took 6 months of negotiations at the Paris Peace Conference to conclude the peace treaty. The treaty was registered by the Secretariat of the League of Nations on the 21st of October 1919. Of the many provisions in the treaty, one of the most important and controversial required Germany accept the responsibility of Germany and her allies for causing all the loss and damage during the war. This article, Article 231, later became known as the War Guilt Clause. The treaty forced Germany to disarm, make substantial territorial concessions, and pay reparations to certain countries that had formed the Entente Powers. In 1921, the total cost of these reparations was assessed at 132 billion marks. At the time, economists, notably John Maynard Keynes, predicted that the treaty was too harsh, a Carthaginian peace, and said the reparations figure was excessive and counterproductive, views that, since then, have been the subject of ongoing debate by historians and economists from several countries. On the other hand, prominent figures on the Allied side such as French Marshal Ferdinand Foch criticized the treaty for treating Germany too leniently. The result of these competing and sometimes conflicting goals among the victors was a compromise that left no one content. Germany was neither pacified nor conciliated, nor was it permanently weakened. The problems that arose from the treaty would lead to the Locarno treaties, which improved relations between Germany and the other European powers, and the renegotiation of the reparation system resulting in the Dawes Plan, the Young Plan, and the indefinite postponement of reparations at the Lausanne Conference of 1932. Although it is often referred to as the Versailles Conference, only the actual signing of the treaty took place at the historic palace. Most of the negotiations were in Paris, with the Big Four meetings taking place generally at the Quai d'Orsay. Background: World War I. The First World War was fought across Europe, the Middle East, Africa and Asia. Countries beyond the war zones were also affected by the disruption of international trade, finance and diplomatic pressures from the belligerents. In 1917, 2 revolutions occurred within the Russian Empire, which led to the collapse of the imperial government and the rise of the Bolshevik Party led by Vladimir Lenin. 14 points. On the 6th of April 1917, the United States entered the war against the Central Powers due to German submarine warfare against merchant ships trading with France and Britain, which led to the sinking of the RMS Lusitania and the loss of 128 American lives, as well as the interception of the Zimmermann telegram, sent by the Empire of Germany to Mexico urging for a declaration of war against the United States. The American war aim was to detach the war from nationalistic disputes and ambitions after the Bolshevik disclosure of secret treaties between the Allies. The existence of these treaties tended to discredit Allied claims that Germany was the sole power with aggressive ambitions. On the 8th of January 1918, United States President Woodrow Wilson issued a statement that became known as the 14 Points. This speech outlined a policy of free trade, open agreements, democracy and self-determination. It also called for a diplomatic end to the war. war, international disarmament, the withdrawal of the Central Powers from occupied territories, the creation of a Polish state, the redrawing of Europe's borders along ethnic lines, and the formation of a League of Nations to afford mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small states alike. Wilson's speech also responded to Vladimir Lenin's decree on peace of November 1917, which proposed an immediate withdrawal of Russia from the war and called for a just and democratic peace uncompromised by territorial annexations. The 14 points were based on the research of the inquiry, a team of about 150 advisors led by foreign policy advisor Edward M. House, into the topics likely to arise in the anticipated peace conference. Europeans generally welcomed Wilson's intervention, but Allied colleagues Georges Clemenceau of France, David Lloyd George of the United Kingdom and Vittorio Emanuele Orlando of Italy were skeptical of Wilsonian idealism. Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, 1918. After the Central Powers launched Operation Faustschlag on the Eastern Front, the new Soviet government of Russia signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany on 3 March 1918. This treaty ended the war between Russia and the Central Powers and annexed 1,300,000 square miles of territory and 62 million people. This loss equated to a third of the Russian population, a quarter of its territory, around a third of the country's arable land, three-quarters of its coal and iron, a third of its factories, and a quarter of its railroads. Armistice. During the autumn of 1918, the Central Powers began to collapse. Desertion rates within the German army began to increase, and civilian strikes drastically reduced war production. On the Western Front, the Allied forces launched the 100 Days Offensive and decisively defeated the German Western armies. Sailors of the Imperial German Navy at Kiel mutinied, which prompted uprisings in Germany, which became known as the German Revolution. The German government tried to obtain a peace settlement based on the 14 points, and maintained it was on this basis that they surrendered. Following negotiations, the Allied Powers and Germany signed an armistice, which came into effect on the 11th of November while German forces were still positioned in France and Belgium. Occupation. The terms of the armistice called for an immediate evacuation of German troops from occupied Belgium, France, and Luxembourg within 15 days. In addition, it established that Allied forces would occupy the Rhineland. In late 1918, Allied troops entered Germany and began the occupation. Blockade. Both the German Empire and Great Britain were dependent on imports of food and raw materials, primarily from the Americas, which had to be shipped across the Atlantic Ocean. The blockade of Germany was a naval operation conducted by the Allied powers to stop the supply of raw materials and foodstuffs reaching the Central Powers. The German Kaiserliche Marine was mainly restricted to the German Bight and used commerce raiders and unrestricted submarine warfare for a counter-blockade. The German Board of Public Health in December 1918 claimed that 763,000 German civilians had died during the Allied blockade, although an academic study in 1928 put the death toll at 424,000 people. Polish uprising. In late 1918, a Polish government was formed and an independent Poland proclaimed. In December, Poles launched an uprising within the German province of Posen. Fighting lasted until February, when an armistice was signed that left the area in Polish hands but technically still a German possession. Negotiations. Negotiations between the Allied powers started on the 18th of January in the Salle de Horloge at the French Foreign Ministry on the Quai d'Orsay in Paris. Initially, 70 delegates delegates from 27 nations participated in the negotiations. The defeated nations of Germany, Austria, and Hungary were excluded from the negotiations. Russia was also excluded because it had negotiated a separate peace with Germany in 1918. The terms of this treaty awarded Germany a large proportion of Russia's land and resources. Its terms were extremely harsh, as the negotiators at Versailles later pointed out. At first, a council of 10, comprising 2 delegates each from Britain, France, the United States, Italy and Japan, met officially to decide the peace terms. It became the Big Four when Japan dropped out, and the top person from each of the other 4 nations met in 145 closed sessions to make all the major decisions to be ratified by the entire assembly. Apart from Italian issues, the main conditions were determined at personal meetings among the leaders of the Big Three nations: British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau, and American President Woodrow Wilson. The minor nations attended a weekly plenary conference that discussed issues in a general forum, but made no decisions. These members formed over 50 commissions that made various recommendations, many of which were incorporated into the final treaty. French aims is the only major Allied power sharing a land border with Germany. France was chiefly concerned with weakening Germany as much as possible. The French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau described France's position best by telling Wilson, "America is far away, protected by the ocean. Not even Napoleon himself could touch England. You are both sheltered, we are not." Clemenceau wished to bring the French border to the Rhine to create a buffer state in the Rhineland, but this demand was not met by the treaty. Instead, France obtained the demilitarization of the Rhineland, a mandate over the Saar, and promises of Anglo-American support in case of a new German aggression. British economist John Maynard Keynes argued, so far as possible, therefore, it was the policy of France to set the clock back and undo what, since 1870, the progressive Germany had accomplished. By loss of territory and other measures, her population was to be curtailed, but chiefly the economic system, upon which she depended for her new strength, the vast fabric built upon iron, coal, and transport, must be destroyed. If France could seize, even in part, what Germany was compelled to drop, the inequality of strength between the two rivals for European hegemony might be remedied for generations. France, which suffered significant destruction in its northern territories and the heaviest human losses among allies, was adamant on the payment of reparations. The failure of the government of the Weimar Republic to pay these reparations led to the occupation of the Ruhr by French and Belgian forces. British aims. Britain had suffered little land devastation during the war, and Prime Minister David Lloyd George supported reparations to a lesser extent than the French. Britain began to look on a restored Germany as an important trading partner and worried about the effect of reparations on the British economy. American aims. Before the end of the war, President Woodrow Wilson put forward his 14 points, which represented the liberal position at the conference and helped shape world opinion. Wilson was concerned with rebuilding the European economy, encouraging self-determination, promoting free trade, creating appropriate mandates for former colonies, and above all, creating a powerful League of Nations that would ensure the peace. He opposed harsh treatment of Germany but was outmaneuvered by Britain and France. He brought the long-top intellectuals as advisors, but his refusal to include prominent Republicans in the American delegation made his efforts seem partisan, and it contributed to a risk of political defeat at home. Treaty. In June 1919, the Allies declared that war would resume if the German government did not sign the treaty they had agreed to among themselves. The government headed by Philipp Scheidmann was unable to agree on a common position, and Scheidmann himself resigned rather than agree to sign the treaty. Gustav Bauer, the head of the new government, sent a telegram stating his intention to sign the treaty if certain articles were withdrawn, including Articles 227, 230 and 231. In response, the Allies issued an ultimatum stating that Germany would have to accept the treaty or face an invasion of Allied forces across the Rhine within 24 hours. On the 23rd of June, Bauer capitulated and sent a second telegram with a confirmation that a German delegation would arrive shortly to sign the treaty. On the 28th of June 1919, the 5th anniversary of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the peace treaty was signed. The treaty had clauses ranging from war crimes, the prohibition on the merging of Austria with Germany without the consent of the League of Nations, freedom of navigation on major European rivers, to the returning of the Quran to the King of Hejaz. Territorial changes. The treaty stripped Germany of 25,000 square miles of territory and 7 million people. It also required Germany to give up the gains made via the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk and grant independence to the protectorates that had been established. In Western Europe, Germany was required to recognize Belgian sovereignty over Moresnet and cede control of the Ypres-Malmedy area. Within 6 months of the transfer, Belgium was required to conduct a plebiscite on whether the citizens of the region wanted to remain under Belgian sovereignty or return to German control, communicate the results to the League of Nations and abide by the League's decision to compensate for the destruction of French coal mines. Germany was to cede the output of the Saar coal mines to France and control of the Saar to the League of Nations for 15 years. A plebiscite would then be held to decide sovereignty. The treaty restored the provinces of Alsace-Lorraine to France by rescinding the treaties of Versailles and Frankfurt of 1871 as they pertained to this issue. The sovereignty of Schleswig-Holstein was to be resolved by a plebiscite to be held at a future time. In Eastern Europe, Germany was to recognize the independence of Czechoslovakia and cede parts of the province of Upper Silesia. Germany had to recognize the independence of Poland and renounce all rights and title over the territory. Portions of Upper Silesia were to be ceded to Poland, with the future of the rest of the province to be decided by plebiscite. The border would be fixed with regard to the vote and to the geographical and economic conditions of each locality. The province of Posen, which had come under Polish control during the Greater Poland Uprising, was also to be ceded to Poland. Pomerelia, on historical and ethnic grounds, was transferred to Poland so that the new state could have access to the sea and became known as the Polish Corridor. The sovereignty of part of southern East Prussia was to be decided via plebiscite, while the East Prussian Soldai area, which was astride the rail line between Warsaw and Danzig, was transferred to Poland outright without plebiscite. An area of 51,800 square kilometers was granted to Poland at the expense of Germany. Memel was to be ceded to the Allied and associated powers for disposal according to the wishes. Germany was to cede the city of Danzig and its hinterland, including the delta of the Vistula River on the Baltic Sea, for the League of Nations to establish the Free City of Danzig. Mandates. Article 119 of the treaty required Germany to renounce sovereignty over former colonies, and Article 22 converted the territories into League of Nations mandates under the control of Allied states. Togoland and German Cameroon were transferred to France. Rwanda and Burundi were allocated to Belgium, whereas German Southwest Africa went to South Africa and the United Kingdom obtained German East Africa. As compensation for the German invasion of Portuguese Africa, Portugal was granted the Kayonga Triangle, a sliver of German East Africa in northern Mozambique. Article 156 of the treaty treaty transferred German concessions in Shandong, China, to Japan, not to China. Japan was granted all German possessions in the Pacific north of the equator, and those south of the equator went to Australia, except for German Samoa, which was taken by New Zealand. Military restrictions. The treaty was comprehensive and complex in the restrictions imposed upon the post-war German armed forces. The provisions were intended to make the Reichswehr incapable of offensive action and to encourage international disarmament. Germany was to demobilize sufficient soldiers by the 31st of March 1920 to leave an army of no more than 100,000 men in a maximum of 7 infantry and 3 cavalry divisions. The treaty laid down the organization of the divisions and support units, and the general staff was to be dissolved. Military schools for officer training were limited to 3, 1 school per arm, and conscription was abolished. Private soldiers and non-commissioned officers were to be retained for at least 12 years and officers for a minimum of 25 years, with former officers being forbidden to attend military exercises. To prevent Germany from building up a large cadre of trained men, the number of men allowed to leave early was limited. The number of civilian staff supporting the army was reduced and the police force was reduced to its pre-war size. With increases limited to population increases, paramilitary forces were forbidden. The Rhineland was to be demilitarized. All fortifications in the Rhineland and 50 kilometers east of the river were to be demolished and new construction was forbidden. Military structures and fortifications on the islands of Heligoland and June were to be destroyed. Germany was prohibited from the arms trade. Limits were imposed on the type and quantity of weapons and prohibited from the manufacture a stockpile of chemical weapons, armored cars, tanks and military aircraft. The German Navy was allowed 6 pre-dreadnought battleships and was limited to a maximum of 6 light cruisers, 12 destroyers, and 12 torpedo boats, and was forbidden submarines. The manpower of the Navy was not to exceed 15,000 men, including manning for the fleet, coast defenses, signal stations, administration, other land services, officers and men of all grades and corps. The number of officers and warrant officers was not allowed to exceed 1,500 men. Germany surrendered 8 battleships, 8 light cruisers, 42 destroyers, and 50 torpedo boats for decommissioning. 32 auxiliary ships were to be disarmed and converted to merchant use. Article 198 prohibited Germany from having an air force, including naval air forces, and required Germany to hand over all aerial-related materials. In conjunction, Germany was forbidden to manufacture or import aircraft-related material for a period of 6 months following the signing of the treaty. Reparations. In Article 231, Germany accepted responsibility for the losses and damages caused by the war as a consequence of the aggression of Germany and her allies. The following articles provided for Germany to compensate the Allied powers and to establish a reparation commission in 1921 to consider German resources and capacity to pay, give the German government an opportunity to be heard and to decide on the amount of reparations to pay. In the interim, the treaty required Germany to pay an equivalent of 20 billion gold marks in gold, commodities, ships, securities or other forms. The money would also be used to pay Allied occupation costs and buy food and raw materials for Germany. Guarantees to ensure compliance. The Rhineland and bridgeheads east of the Rhine were to be occupied by Allied troops for 15 years. If Germany had not committed aggression, a staged withdrawal would take place after 5 years. The Cologne bridgehead and the territory north of the line along the Ruhr would be evacuated. After 10 years, the bridgehead at Koblenz and the territories to the north would be evacuated, and after 15 15 years remaining Allied forces would be withdrawn. If Germany reneged on the treaty obligations, the bridgeheads would be reoccupied immediately. International Organizations Part 1 of the treaty, as per all the treaties signed during the Paris Peace Conference, was the Covenant of the League of Nations, which provided for the creation of the League, an organization for the arbitration of international disputes. Part 13 organized the establishment of the International Labour Officer to regulate hours of work, including a maximum working day and week, the regulation of the labor supply, the prevention of unemployment, the provision of a living wage, the protection of the worker against sickness, disease and injury arising out of his employment, the protection of children, young persons and women, provision for old age and injury, protection of the interests of workers when employed abroad, recognition of the principle of freedom of association, the organization of vocational and technical education and other measures. The treaty also called for the signatories to sign or ratify the International Opium Convention,